Well, maybe I should tell you that Walt passed away before we actually broke ground in the Disney World. But in the 2 years previous to that, we had toured that pasture land in a Jeep, and what he had planned and visualized is almost what you see today, including the location of Epcot. It was amazing. Now, the details were not all the same, because there was a time when Epcot, as you know, was covered by a great big glass dome. But maybe it would be well to go back just a bit and say that the acquisition of the property here in Florida was probably the best kept secret that has ever been known in this country. There were only 5 of us in the company that knew exactly where the land we had finally selected. For some 2 years previous to that, we'd had a man, Bob Foster, who was stationed here in Florida, and he roamed, and we had 2 other associates. One was the head of the bank here that knew it was Disney, but other than that, nobody knew. They knew it was in Florida, but that was all. You see, for the first, and I find myself going back again, I think maybe this would be interesting to you. From the time we opened Disneyland, it was a great success. And oh my God, I must. When I divert.
The land here in Florida.
Oh, the land in Florida, yes. I used to tour. I bet I know more individual towns in the state of Florida than any other human being. Up and down one coast and the other. I came into Johnny's Corner one day. This was, 6 or 8 months before we opened Disneyland, Disney World. Before we started construction, I should say. And the old boy that ran it came from Vermont. And he said, oh, this has been a terrible season. He said, if somebody come along, he said, how about you? I dropped in for a cup of coffee and a sandwich. He said, you've $2,000, I'll sell you the whole thing. Oh, one of them were the finest corners, you know, down there. And, of course, I didn't disclose who I was, except I was a visitor from up north, just taking a look around, etc. But I couldn't help but think I could have bought that whole property for $2,000. At least he offered it to me. And subsequently, when we bought the big property, some 28,000 plus acres, and paid $189 an acre for it, 1 year later, we had to buy part of this land that the Johnny's Corner owned, and we paid at the rate of $100,000 an acre 1 year later. Now that, of course, was an exception. But believe me, the land was the closest kept secret. I used to have to go back and report to the board of directors. I looked at a piece of property, 5,000 acres south of the airport, and I went back. I had to keep the board of directors advised. I didn't tell them where it was, but I said we didn't identify. We knew it was in Florida. That's all. And I said, Joe, what in the heck do you want 5,000 acres for? Why, you only got 260 acres at Disneyland. I said, yeah, but let me tell you, Walt said he wants a piece of property big enough so he won't have a Las Vegas Harbor Boulevard on one side and West Street, and not with all the honky-tonk and so forth and so on. He wants to have a place big enough so he can have his park, control the periphery, etc., and so forth. Well, to make a long story short, as you know, we bought the property, and the way we bought it was this. We had, early in the game, when Arrow Development was making so many of our rides, Roy and Walt decided the best thing to do was to get control of Arrow Development, because practically all of our work was there. That we were their big support, and we wanted to be sure that we had priority. So they bought 51% of the stock, and then Walt turned to me and said, all right, Joe, you look after it. So I had to more or less look after Arrow Development. Oh, we had more fun. We rebuilt it and so forth. But anyway, Arrow Development had built the overhead railroad at Busch Gardens in Tampa. So I always had an excuse for coming to Florida. And I'd land in Tampa, and then I'd visit Busch Gardens, and we'd talk over the railroad that they were putting in over the animals and so forth. And then I'd get a car, and I'd tour over Florida, and I'd leave from somewhere in Jacksonville or one on the West Coast and have no identification of who I was or so forth. Apropos of that, I might tell you that one of the last things we did before we disclosed our purchase of it, I hired G& Jensen, a big firm of civil engineers in West Palm Beach, and I met them at a real estate office in Miami. And I actually engaged them to start in doing the work on this plot when were ready to go. And I said I was a retired rear admiral from the state of Maine with an office in New York. That's the only identification I had. They laughed at that more times. It was true. I came from Maine, and Disney had a big office in New York, but that was how we maintained the secrecy. Anyway, the time came when we were about to disclose, but Walt wanted to see. We'd written over various and sundry things, but he wanted to see the property before we made the final decision and disclosed it to the public. So we came in on our own plane to Tampa. We had an excuse, put up at the International Hotel. And Walt was a great one when he wanted to travel like that. He traveled incognito. So, and he did the same thing in Europe. Of course, everybody knew who he was. But at the Oktoberfest, nobody would disclose it. He was Mr. Smith. So we came into the International Hotel in Tampa, and we registered as Mr. Smith. He and I registered as Mr. Williams. My middle name is Joseph Williams. And we were with the bellboys getting our bags together. When over the loudspeaker came a call, Admiral Fowler, phone call. And Walt looked at me, and the manager came out and said, "Gee, I'm so sorry," and so forth. And they all laughed and so forth. Well, anyway, we saw Busch Gardens. We got in our plane the next morning, and we flew over the property. And he saw the lake. He saw the whole thing. You never saw anybody enthusiastic. Card Walker was with us, and 2 or 3 of the others. I think, I don't remember in detail who besides myself. And Walt said, "All right, fellas, it's all settled. We'll buy it." That was it. And, you know, a few days later we disclosed it to the press at the hotel. But that's how we acquired the land, and it was a great problem. Let me finish, if you have no other questions, let me finish by telling you my last contact with Walt. On a Friday, Roy called me. I was in Disneyland. He said, "Walt wants to see you." Walt, of course, had been very ill. He was in the hospital in St. Joseph's. And "Can you come up this afternoon?" I said, "Why, of course." And so I went over to Walt's room. They had a parquet ceiling in the room with the squares. Walt got an extra pillow and propped himself up in bed, and we spent 2 hours of his planning the Disney World. He said, "This is where the monorail would come in," and of course a lot of it we had talked over before, but he planned, and you never saw such enthusiasm in your life. He died at 11 o'clock the next morning. And I want to tell you, so many times when I was building Disney World and the problems that came up, and we were having a little bit of a adjustment to make and so forth, and I felt that he was looking over my shoulder when I made this decision. All right, gentlemen.
Joe, I have one last question.
That by all means, my friends, if you want, and I'm sure you all do, the Disney operation of Disneyland, Disney World, and the other facets of the company to continue to be the fabulous success that they still are, you must maintain the Disney image. And it was something Walt emphasized from the day that we opened, the day we started building Disneyland. I could tell you so many things, Bob, about the staff that we set up when we opened Disneyland. All right, to get back to this. Whatever you do, fellas, don't lose this Disney image. Remember, it's a family entertainment. Keep it that way. And we can... Well, for the first, I guess, maybe 4 or 5 years we operated Disneyland, he'd been asked by almost every country in Europe to build a Disneyland over there, including the head of Egypt. He used to have me handle all that correspondence, so I knew, and I had one more or less stereotyped reply, "Well, I'm sorry, but we are so busy improving Disneyland, we have more work than our art directors can take care of." That was what Walt felt. So he wouldn't entertain any feeling for building another one until we had the World's Fair in New York. We built 4 exhibits there, and I could talk to you for 3 hours of what happened there. We won't. But then he said, well, I guess what we've got to do is to have another Disneyland. So we looked at, I don't know how many places. We looked in Denver, Colorado. We looked in up in New England, Springfield. We looked in New York. Boy, it's 30 acres across the place. We looked in St. Louis, and I must tell you this story. This was really we had gone so far in St. Louis, right in the shadow of the arches, that we had a big building, which we had an option on. It had 4 stories below ground and 5 stories above ground. And we had laid out the attractions. We couldn't get land to put an outside affair, so this was to be an internal Disney operation, but along the same lines of entertainment, etc. And we had spent 2 months off and on looking at this and planning almost in detail the rides and the attractions we were having at the on the individual decks. It was only about 2 blocks from this Anheuser-Busch Stadium, and of course he more or less was the great man in St. Louis. Now, the bankers were enthusiastic about this, and we had a big banquet the night before the final papers were to be signed. Walt was there, Anheuser-Busch, the mayor of St. Louis was sitting beside me, when Mr. Bush got up and he said, any man that thinks he can open and make a success of any amusement park and not sell beer or hard liquor ought to have his head examined. Walt was sitting right beside me, and I saw that eyebrow go up. And I said, the mayor, this is the end. He said, oh, he was so mad at Bush. He said, I never can control that guy, and so forth. Sure enough, we embarked the next morning, and we had our own plane to go back to California. And Walt said, all right, fellas, forget it. No St. Louis. And that was all. Just like that. The bankers came out, I think 3 times, tried to get Walt to change his mind. No, so. And of course, it's a wise thing when we went to Florida. But we had some exciting times. Niagara Falls, New York. Well, I say I could talk for hours on those things. But anyway, all right.